Everyone, Caleb Maupin is here. He is back. So I definitely want to get your insight about the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. I know you've seen a lot of things on Twitter as well. There's been a lot of people going around calling people Russian apologists, saying that they're secret Russian assets. I just heard the other day that RT was taken down in some countries. So I want to get your take on this. Can you please explain to everyone what really started this whole conflict? Because from what I've read, this has been going on for 8 years.
Sure. Well, as far as the first thing that you said, my personal Twitter account that belongs to me personally, does not belong to my employers at RT, has nothing to do with anybody in Russia, just belongs to me, a US born citizen from Ohio who doesn't even speak Russian, who doesn't come from a Russian family, has been labeled Russian state affiliated media. And that's BS. My employers at RT do not tell me what to tweet. Nobody in Russia tells me what to tweet. I decide what I put on my personal Twitter account. And the fact that Twitter labeled it that way shows you what they're doing. They don't want you to listen to what certain people have to say. And so they pin a label on them and say, oh, don't believe anything they say because they're this. Meanwhile, you know, I mean, just watching that clip that you just showed me, I mean, and you just showed on there I mean, how much fake news is coming out from mainstream media? So many videos that have been debunked, that have been from Libya or from Syria or from Palestine or from Iraq or from video games are circulating. I mean, they are just putting out fake clips everywhere, but we're supposed to keep trusting them. And then because I work at a Russian company, you know, you can just push this, you can just pin this on my Twitter and label me as a Russian asset or whatever. When I'm a patriotic American from here in the United States, I'm a socialist, I'm a left winger. You know, I was marching in support of the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk back in 2014 before I ever worked at RT. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. But as far as how this started when the United States overthrew Ukraine's government. In 2014, the United States toppled the elected government led by Viktor Yanukovych, and they installed a virulently anti-Russian government. And the people in the eastern regions declared independence. And they asked Russia to recognize their independent governments, and Russia said no. And instead, Russia supported the Minsk agreement. And they said, no, we don't want you to join Russia. We don't want you to be independent of Ukraine. We want you to reintegrate back into Ukraine, and we have been supporting the Minsk peace process to allow and enable that to happen. That's what happened. And in 2015, those Minsk agreements were signed and they were not implemented. The exact opposite of what those Minsk agreements said was carried out. They shelled and bombed and attacked and sent drones to attack the eastern regions. 14,000 people are dead. And these regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, have continually been attacked. Now, then about a month ago, we had US officials who came out and they just started announcing to the world that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. And Russia was like, no, we're not. We're not going to invade Ukraine. That's not going to happen. We're not going to invade Ukraine. And they said, no, Russia is about to invade Ukraine. And Russia said, we are not planning to invade Ukraine. And Russia actually started moving their troops away from the border to prove that they weren't going to invade Ukraine. And just as they started moving their troops away from the border, that is when there were bombs that went off. And, you know, on Friday, you had explosions in Donetsk, explosions in Lugansk, and these explosions started going off, and you had an escalation of the shelling. And then it became clear what the United States was doing. They were threatening to invade. They were playing up the idea that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine, so that when they went and did an all-out, you know, onslaught to retake these eastern regions, Russia would feel they weren't able to move in and protect the people there. That's what it was. It was a maneuver. They were going to set the stage for. They knew that they were planning to attack these eastern regions, and they knew Russia would feel obligated to protect the people there. So they were trying to psych up the world for when Russia moved in to protect these people, Russia would look like the aggressor. And for a month, they beat the drum that Russia's about to invade Ukraine. And then they went ahead and attacked the eastern regions. And Russia said, okay, now we know what's going on. And so they moved their forces in. They recognized, after 8 years of waiting, they recognized the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Lugansk. And then from there, after that, they sent their forces furthermore into Ukraine to break apart the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military that has been shelling and bombing and attacking the people of the eastern regions for the past 8 years has killed 14,000 of them. Not only do they want to protect the people there, but they want to break apart that Ukrainian military that the US government has been pouring weapons into, that has a special neo-Nazi division called the Azov Battalion. They want to break it up so that they can't continue to terrorize these people. And they will withdraw their forces from the country. They have no intention of occupying Ukraine, but they're not going to withdraw their forces until they have a clear understanding that Ukraine is not going to join the NATO alliance and Ukraine is going to leave the people of Lugansk and Donetsk alone. This is a picture you will never see on CNN. And I've got this picture here because they have never shown it on CNN. The whole world needs to see this. This is a monument in Lugansk to all the children who have died from the shelling that has taken place with US-made weapons. These are stuffed animals down here, and these are the faces of all the children who've been killed. All of these people have been dying over the past 8 years. These are children, they've got parents, they've got brothers and sisters, they've got mothers, they've got fathers, they've got their names here on the memorial below. All of these people were killed by the US-aligned regime in Kiev. They were killed. These are all children under the age of 18, most of them under the age of 12, who died as a result of what this government has been doing. And Russia has sat back and said, implement the Minsk agreements, just implement the Minsk agreements. They waited for 8 years. When Biden called this an unprovoked action last night, that was ridiculous. It has been provoked and provoked and provoked and provoked. It was provoked when the USA toppled the Ukrainian government and installed a fanatical anti-Russian government in Kiev. It was provoked when they shelled the eastern regions and attacked these people. It was provoked when the USA talked about having the Ukrainian government that is so hostile to Russia join NATO. It was provoked when the government in Kiev announced that they were thinking about getting nuclear weapons. It was provoked. Can you imagine for a moment that some racist conservative governor in Texas or Arizona or New Mexico passed a law and started taking Latino or Chicano people to court for speaking Spanish, right? That would be rightly denounced as a very racist, evil thing to do. But that's what the government in Kiev has been doing. They have been giving people tickets and taking them to court, giving them court appearances for speaking Russian, their own language. Can you believe this? This is what they've been doing for the past 8 years. People have been dragged to court, fined for speaking their own language. They have torn down World War II memorials. There are World War II memorials all over Ukraine because many Ukrainians heroically fought the Nazis. But the new government that was installed by the United States has been tearing those World War II memorials down and instead building memorials to the people who fought on the side of the Nazis, the Stepan Bandera, Ukrainian Liberation Fighting Force, whatever they want to call themselves. They've been building memorials to Nazi collaborators. They made this group of fascists and Hitler admirers, they made them an official wing of the government. And all these people say, oh, it's called the Azov Battalion. And whenever you bring this up, the people say, oh, that's just a small group. It doesn't matter if it's a small group. If we made the Ku Klux Klan an official wing of the US government, it wouldn't matter if there were 100 of them or 5 of them. That's a statement, in and of itself. And people say, well, Vladimir Zelensky, the president, is Jewish. Yes, he is. Vladimir Zelensky was elected on a platform of bringing the country back together, of peace. And he took office and he didn't do that because it's very apparent he doesn't have the real power. The real power in Ukraine is in the hands of the military and it's in the hands of the United States. They say that Ukraine is an independent country. It's not independent. It is very clearly directed by a network of NGOs and Pentagon advisors. And Zelensky, who took office saying he was going to bring the country back together, he was going to start getting along with Russia, he was going to make this whole division in the country go away. He wasn't able to do it because he doesn't really run the country. The country is being directed by the United States, by Britain, by France, by Germany, by NATO. It's being directed by weapons contractors, and it's being used. And the most horrible thing about this is that they are making it sound like the United States cares so much for the Ukrainian people. But if the reality is, if you cared about the Ukrainian people, you wouldn't push them into a war with Russia and throw their lives away like this. And that's what has gone on. The Ukrainian people largely don't want a war, right? They don't want a war. They might some of them might be hostile to Russia. Some of them might like Russia. Some of them might be indifferent. They don't like what's happening right now in the country. And if you really care about the people of Ukraine, you wouldn't be pushing them into a conflict with a great power. So that's a lot that needs to be said that you're never going to hear on American mainstream media.
Very good points. Let's talk about the sanctions, because I am pretty troubled that I've been hearing. I'm talking about people in left independent media making excuses for sanctions, saying, oh, just a little bit of sanctions is okay. I'm appalled by this. I guess I shouldn't be shocked because a lot of people's talking points have changed over the past year. But I want to make it very clear to people, sanctions are not a good thing, because the United States government put sanctions on Afghanistan and people are starving in Afghanistan because of that. And last night, I watched that State of the Union address, and Joe Biden is bragging about that. And I'm watching all of them stand up and clap. And my fear is that the average American who is probably not watching any type of independent media, only watch CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, they're going to think that's a good thing and not really like realize what that does to all the people. It's not just the people who are on the battlefield. It's not just the people. It's not just Putin. It's all of the civilians there will be affected, and people can starve because of that. And I feel like the average person that I bring this up to, they don't realize that. And so I want to get your take on that, about putting sanctions on Russia. And how do you feel about some of the talking points that's been coming out of left independent media about this conflict?
Well, first of all, I think we can look at this beyond Russia, right? Let's just, put Russia aside for the moment. Russia is one of the main producers of fertilizer in the world. And right now we're already having, a crisis of malnutrition. And in Africa, there have been millions of malnutrition related deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. In South America, there have been a lot of malnutrition related deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. And the supply chain issues and the slowdown in the global economy, for us in the United States, it's caused a lot of people to lose their jobs and their incomes have gone down. It's hurt a lot of working families. But in countries like, the third world, where people are in very, very low conditions already, this pandemic and the economic fallout has killed people. And so now these sanctions that are going to be put on Russia will prevent Russia from exporting fertilizer. And Brazil, the representative of Brazil, that got up and spoke at the UN, pointed out that if Brazil is not able to get the Russian fertilizer that's set to be sent to Brazil, there are not going to be crops that grow in Brazil. And the same for many African countries. These sanctions that are being imposed, they're going to have a big effect in Russia, no doubt. And they're going to cost a lot to ordinary Russian people that have nothing to do with this conflict. But on top of that, they are going to take a humanitarian toll around the world. I mean, there are going to be a lot of crops that do not grow because Russian fertilizer does not get there. And this is the weird thing about Joe Biden. He seems to have no problem killing people via starvation, because, after Afghanistan was devastated by 20 years of U.S. occupation, he then pulled out of Afghanistan in a very chaotic way. And he froze all their funds. And Afghanistan is now having a crisis of malnutrition. And he froze all of their money. He gave it to the 9/11 victims now, who have nothing to do. Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. It was a Saudi named Osama bin Laden who was officially blamed for 9/11. No one blames the Afghan people for 9/11. So Joe Biden essentially starved millions of Afghans. I mean, there are thousands, if not millions, of Afghans who are suffering from malnutrition now because of Joe Biden's decision to freeze their money and take Afghanistan's money in the middle of an economic crisis, in the middle of the aftermath of years of occupation and instability in the country. So now it looks like Joe Biden is going to deprive the world of Russia's fertilizer. And the humanitarian cost of that is massive. And that is terrifying. I mean, when we think about it, that is absolutely terrifying. I mean, this is an action that's going to cost a lot of lives.
This is terrible. Like, it's just, I don't think it. How many people do you think, people that you've spoken to, how many of them are aware of this part?
None. This is not widely discussed, right? Russian media is talking about it. People in the developing world are talking about it. They're talking about it in Brazil. They're talking about it in Africa. But the United States is certainly not talking about it. And U.S. media is covering it up. What they're doing right now is they're just having this hysterical, emotional campaign. Look at Ukraine. Look how bad they're suffering. Don't you feel sorry for them? What? You don't care? Oh, you're not mad at Putin now? You have no heart. You're not waving the Ukrainian flag. You haven't put a Ukrainian flag up on your Facebook. You heartless person. It's this big emotional campaign. One of the best video analyses of what I saw, they compared it to arguing in a public place with someone who's crying. Imagine you're in a public place and someone's arguing with you, and they start crying. Well, you have to stop arguing that at that point, because no one is going to know what you're arguing about, but they're just going to see that person crying and they're going to go, oh, what a heartless person. You're arguing with this poor person who's crying. That's what they're doing in US media. No one knows anything about Ukraine. You know, so many of these people that are suddenly just so moved and emotional about the Ukrainian people, they can't find Ukraine on a map. They have no idea what's going on, and it's not their fault. That's the fault of American media. It's the fault of the American educational system. But now the public is being psyched up to hysterically support a war, to support a government that has been shelling and attacking its own people for 8 years and killed lots of its own people, that has been propping up forces that want to rehabilitate the Nazis and Nazi collaborators. Has been pushing some of the most, virulent, hate and hostility as an official fascist wing of its military. That's who they want to support. And they don't want to acknowledge that the United States pushed Ukraine into this. The United States piled weapons into Ukraine. The Ukrainian people voted for Zelensky because he was going to stop this. And he wasn't allowed to, because Ukraine is not really an independent country. It's a colony of Wall Street and London and US imperialism. And that aspect of this conflict isn't being portrayed. It's basically the way we're hearing about it in mainstream American media is that, Putin was having a bad day and he hates freedom, and he saw this country, Ukraine, and he was like, oh, they're free and I can't stand it. And he rolled the tanks in. And that's so far from what is happening. There was one CNN anchor who said that Ukraine was a, quote, peaceful country before this event. It's like, it wasn't a peaceful country for the past 8 years, I'll tell you that much. And that just shows you how delusional the narrative we're getting is. So yeah, there you go. It's deeply, deeply frustrating. But now it's a really important time for those of us who are anti-imperialists, because I'm seeing a lot of waffling now. I'm seeing a lot of people that are saying things like, sure, the United States and NATO, they did a lot to provoke this, but Russia is still wrong. And no, hold the line, right? That is what I'm telling people. Stand firm. Stand firm on this. Russia doesn't want to be doing this. Russia would prefer, they wanted the Minsk agreements to be recognized and Ukraine to bring Lugansk and Donetsk back into Ukraine. They don't want this, and they have to do it. And they felt that they have no other choice, that NATO is setting up shop on their border, that the people of Lugansk and Donetsk are being slaughtered. They feel like they have no other choice. And honestly, I think Russia probably should have done this 8 years ago. And if the left wing, if the Communist Party, which is a very big party in Russia, had been in power 8 years ago, they would have done this a lot sooner. This idea, this understanding of events that we're hearing in the United States is just so far off. It's ridiculous. And look, Russia is doing this because they feel they have to. And it could stop at any point. If the Ukrainian authorities really care about their people, all they'd have to say is, fine, we'll leave the people in Donetsk and Lugansk alone. We'll stop importing U.S. weapons, and Russia would withdraw their forces. They've made that offer over and over and over again. And they're not willing to bring that up. One analogy I've made many, many times, and I must make this analogy, is, every time Israel goes into Gaza and just starts slaughtering people, right? We remember this. It's happened so many times. Israel will go into Gaza, and it'll always be in response to like 1 or 2 rockets from the Palestinians that will hit Israel, maybe 1 or 2 people being killed. And then they'll go in and they'll slaughter hundreds of people, right? And the mainstream U.S. media in the United States always says, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, here you have a situation where Russia has waited. It hasn't been 1 rocket or 2 rockets. It's been thousands of rockets and 14,000 people dead for 8 years straight. And now Russia is taking action. And they call it an unprovoked invasion or something like that. This is absolutely ridiculous. If Israel has a right to defend itself against 1 rocket, doesn't Russia have the right to defend the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk against 8 years of violent attacks? This is so much of a double standard, from U.S. media. And it's deeply, deeply frustrating. And that's why those of us in alternative media, those of us who don't buy into it, we need to just scream from the heavens that, okay, this is bad. I'm not happy this is happening, right? The people there obviously are suffering. That's an awful situation. But Russia is in the right, and the Ukrainian government, backed up by the United States, is in the wrong. Look, I'll tell you one thing. The fact that the Ukrainian government is calling for international volunteers right now, okay, like all they would have to do is sign, a treaty to leave Donetsk and Lugansk alone, not, take in any more U.S. weapons, and this would be over. But their official military has basically collapsed at this point, and they're calling for people from around the world to go to Ukraine and fight on their behalf. Why is that preferable to ending the war? I mean, who is really in charge here? It sounds like the United States really wants Ukraine to become the Soviet Union or Russia's Afghanistan, right? They want Russia to have to be there for a long time. They want the fighting to go on for years. They want people to just keep. I mean, that's what they want to go on here. I can guarantee you, as many Ukrainians as there are who don't like Russia and are mad at Russia, that's not what they want for their homeland. They don't want their homeland to become the next Afghanistan where there's fighting going on for years and years and years. But that's what the Ukrainian government seems to want. That's what they want, and it's shocking. And it shows you, again, they keep saying that Ukraine is independent. Ukraine is not independent. It's a colony of the United States. It's a colony of the West. If it was really an independent country, then Zelensky would have been able to deliver on his campaign promises and de-escalate all of this.
Well said. How do you feel about, so I did a poll last night and I wanted to make a comparison. So I'm going to share my screen because I saw this poll from Breaking Points and it was deeply concerning to me because that's independent media. Obviously, Crystal's on the left, Saugers, supposedly be on the right, but not like Trump right. But these numbers were concerning to me. And this is the second poll I've seen from them about war, where the majority of their audience members support war. So this was the question. Do you support Western sanctions and economic warfare against Russia? 66% of their viewers said yes. And 19% said no. 15% said unsure. But 66% said yes. And I'm wondering to myself, like, do they even know what that really means? Like, how could you support sanctions? Like, do you know what happens when the United States government puts sanctions on other countries? Or maybe they know and they just don't care.
No, they don't know. They have no idea. Sanctions sounds really benign, right? It sounds very, very benign. It's a euphemism, right? It's a way of saying, we're going to sanction countries. I don't know. I used to really like that show, Third Rock from the Sun. You ever watch that show? It was like a 90s sitcom. And I remember there's an episode where he's a college professor and he's done something wrong or something. And they're like, you as a college professor, you're going to be sanctioned. And he's like, well, what does that mean? And they said, that means that you will be officially sanctioned. And he says, well, does that mean that I'm going to have a pay cut or anything? They said, no. But if you do it again, they said, you will be, they had some other term. And he said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, that means you'll get, you'll be suspended for 3 days. And he says, with pay? And they said, yes. And he said, can I be that now? And they said, no, you're sanctioned. I mean, it's a vague term that just means like punished or something like that. Right. But in terms of economics, it's not a joke. It's a very, very serious thing. It's a very, very serious thing. It prevents people from doing business. When I was in Iran, I met people who, couldn't become airline pilots because Iran doesn't have enough airplane parts because the United States manufactures a lot of airplane parts and has sanctioned any airline that would sell, airline parts to Iran. So Iran only has a certain number of airplanes. And there's a lot of Iranians who want to become airline pilots who can't do it because they don't have enough planes because of the sanctions. When I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador, I met a Cuban young man, teenager, who was in a wheelchair. And he was in a wheelchair because he could not get certain medicine that is sanctioned and prevented from getting into Cuba because of the economic blockade and embargo facing Cuba. This guy's in a wheelchair. He can't walk because of sanctions. There are people, the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have caused, a food crisis that has cost thousands of lives, according to the United Nations. These sanctions are not, they're not benign. They're very, very serious, right? And by calling them sanctions, it's a euphemism. It's economic warfare is what it should be called. It's war without bombs. It's using starvation as a weapon of war. That's what it is. And it should be absolutely opposed. And most of these sanctions are unilateral, meaning the United States imposes them without, consulting with any other country. And a lot of these sanctions are imposed in the form of a state of emergency, where the president imposes them, claiming that there's some kind of national security threat to the United States. Meaning that he doesn't even have the constitutional power to do it. If we're going to, pass a law that you can't do business with this country or that country, that should go through Congress. But there's a loophole where the president can declare a state of emergency with regard to Zimbabwe, or a state of emergency with regard to Russia or Iran, and he doesn't even have to get the permission of Congress, but he has to claim somehow these countries are a threat to the United States. Zimbabwe is not a threat to the United States. Belarus is not a threat to the United States. Russia is not a threat to the United States. So even the legality of how these sanctions are imposed is absolutely ridiculous. And it's done in a way that there doesn't even really have to be much debate about it. The president just feels like it and says that based on something, somehow it's a threat to America or something. So the president does it unilaterally. I mean, it's really ridiculous.
Interesting. So I want to show you this as well, because I asked my audience that same poll last night. And these are the results. Same question. Do you support Western sanctions and economic warfare against Russia? 81% said no. And so that, to me, it says something about the talking points. And I don't know why this is happening, but I've seen too many people, whether it's been on shows, whether it's been on Twitter, who are on the left, all of a sudden, now that Biden's president and Trump is not, they're making excuses for this.
Yeah. I mean, it's deeply, deeply disturbing to me. And it seems like that is one of the dangerous aspects of all of this wokeism, is that they have turned social justice and being a socially aware and conscious person and being concerned about things like racism and injustice and income inequality, and they've flipped it around to being an advocate of imperialism. I went to college, and I hated college. But before I went to college, my whole family said to me, Caleb, you're going to love college. You're always reading books and you're learning about countries. You're going to love college. College is going to be so amazing for you. And I went to college and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. But that's because what the universities in the United States are has drastically changed. During the Cold War in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, after the 1960s political upsurge mainly, universities in the United States were kind of bastions of free thought. Your average Americans were, in my country, right or wrong, supported the wars and such, but people went to college, and in college they learned that there's two sides to every story. They learned that there might be another side to Nicaragua or Iraq or whatever was going on, and colleges were a little more of a free-thinking place. But now it's flipped. Average working class Americans, they may not know very much about Ukraine or Afghanistan or China or whatever, but they don't want new wars, and they don't trust the government, and they are suspicious of authority, and they're watching the country fall apart. Meanwhile, it's people who go to college who get kind of indoctrinated into the new woke imperialist, mantra. And you go to college and you learn to repeat what the professor says, and you learn and you get kind of ideologically cleansed to make sure that you are trustworthy enough to get a place in the middle class. And the most blatant place that I saw this was when I worked at the United Nations. When I was in the UN press corps, I worked with a TV network from the Middle East, a small TV network, but there's not many journalists who are at the UN all year round. There's a very small press corps at the UN, and I had an office at the UN, and I was right next to ABC News and CBS and Fox. And these people had gone to Harvard, they had gone to Yale, they had gone to Stanford, the best schools of journalism. These were people that were like the most qualified. And I would talk to them and tell them how we were covering things related to Syria or Russia or other countries around the world that were controversial. And their jaws would drop because they had never heard these arguments before. And these are like the smartest people, the people with the highest level of education. And I was shocked. I thought, how can these be like the smartest people in the country? And they have no clue what the other side of the story is. How is this even possible? But then I realized that's how they got there to begin with. That education in the United States has basically become a test of conformity. And if you conform and obey and learn to repeat what your professor says and learn to, repeat the talking points in the party line, and you don't think about it too much, you can get ahead. And if you question things, if you're some person who is a little more, capable of asking difficult questions or thinking more deeply, you get punished in American education. American education is the opposite of what it's supposed to be. My whole life I've heard people say, I think for myself. That's this whole American thing. Think for yourself, right? Think for yourself. Everyone thinks for themselves. I used to hand out leaflets, anti-war leaflets. People say, oh no, I can't take that. I think for myself. So I don't want you to corrupt me with that. But the funny thing is, everyone who thinks for themselves thinks exactly the same way. They all have the exact same conclusions. Whereas it's those of us who dare to consume alternative media, it's those of us who dare to hear the other side of the story. We tend to think a little bit differently. And in a lot of ways, thinking for ourselves is kind of become a euphemism for not thinking at all. Americans can't find their country on a map, right? We can't. I mean, we can't find the countries we're bombing on a map. We're so busy thinking for ourselves and having no one tell us what to think and making up our own minds that we have no clue what's going on in the world. And we, when the US media is whipping us up into a hysteria about Ukraine, we just go along with it. It really goes to show you how hypocritical a lot of this is. What they're doing to my TV network where I work, RT, right now is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the way that we have been, banned from the airwaves in the European Union, the way that they're targeting us in the United Kingdom, the way that our website is being targeted. It is absolutely insane. If every country that did something that the international community didn't agree with was treated this way, it would be very, very different. The UN has voted over and over and over again to condemn Israel for what they do to the Palestinians. But, you don't see them banning Israeli TV networks, banning Israeli websites. You don't see that, right? The UN has voted every year, like practically since the Cuban Revolution, almost every year since then, the UN has voted to condemn the U.S. blockade of Cuba. And it's overwhelming. The U.S. blockade of Cuba is condemned by the UN General Assembly because the U.S. blockade of Cuba is inhumane. It is unbelievable. They're blocking medicine, and the UN overwhelmingly votes to condemn the blockade of Cuba. But yet, no country in the world is banning U.S. TV networks because of that. No country in the world is shutting down U.S. TV networks because of what the USA has done. The USA has killed millions of people in Vietnam and Korea. The USA invaded Iraq without, based on lies about weapons of mass destruction, without any possible justification. And you didn't see the world community banning, U.S. media because of that. So this is the singling out and targeting of Russia. And when it really gets down to is that Russia is never going to be allowed to be part of the club, right? The Western imperial countries, the former colonizers, the British, the Americans, the French, the Germans, they have been dominating the world for a long time. They've dominated the world economy. And they have been, World War I and World War II was largely these countries fighting over which chunk of the world they got. The Germans wanted a chunk of the world for themselves, and the British and the Americans wanted them to not have it. And so you had World War I. After World War I, Germany was stripped of its colonies. And so then Hitler came back in and started re-seizing territory and trying to re-seize territory. So we had World War II. But the Western capitalist countries have always dominated the world. Well, in the 20th century, Russia and China both had socialist revolutions. They overthrew capitalism. And with socialist methods, they raised their people out of poverty. They electrified their countries. They raised their people up. They built modern electricity and power plants and steel mills. And with socialism, they both became superpowers. Both of these countries, Russia and China, became superpowers. However, the Western imperialists have said, well, you're not allowed to be a superpower. We're the superpowers. You can't be part of the club. Right? You may have had your revolutions, you may have built yourselves up, but we're never going to let you become just equal members of the global economy. We have kind of an arrangement among ourselves that we don't all like each other. The French and the Americans, the British and the Germans, we fight with each other, but we have an arrangement among ourselves, but we all agree you're not allowed to be part of the club. It's like a mafia cartel. It's really what it is, right? The local criminal gangs may fight with each other. They don't like each other. But at the end of the day, they do have an agreement among themselves that if somebody else comes along, they're gonna not let them. They're all gonna line up against them. And that's the thing. They won't let Russia and China just be real developed countries that are part of the global economy. And I think, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was basically promised that they would be allowed that. And in the 1990s, their economy was very, very bad. But Putin came in and he fixed their economy by reasserting government control over oil and gas. And Russia was under the impression that they would be allowed to just be a real country that had their own interest and had their own economy and had their own industries and all of that. And the United States has made clear it will not allow that. It doesn't care that they used to be communist. They're not communist anymore, right? The Soviet Union's over. Doesn't matter. It was never about communism to begin with. It was about the fact that Russia used to be poor, and now Russia is a fully developed country, and they don't want the competition. That's not how they want the world economy to be. And the same with China, right? They don't like the fact that China used to be poor and now is a fully developed economy. It's the second largest economy in the world. They don't like that. They don't want the competition. And that's what it really gets down to. All their talk about free markets and free trade, That's a joke. They don't really believe in that. If they don't want to compete on a level playing field with Russia and China, and they will drive, they apparently want to drive these countries out of the economy with war.
Agreed. And what you said about universities is so true, because I worked in higher ed for years. And actually, when Bernie was running, I was still working in higher ed, and I heard a Bernie sticker in my office. Boy, was that a mistake, because people would come into my office and they would say, "Oh, are you a socialist?" And I'm like, is that a problem? Like, it was just really weird. I was like, oh, so much for free thought and being liberating here at these universities. They are more on the conservative side than people may realize. I do want to shout out the super chats really quick. Thanks so much, Black in the Empire, for the super chat. Love you, Sabby. Great to see Caleb on. Thank you so much. And thanks, Cheese Sandwich, for the super chat. Says thanks. Thanks so much. Ashura says, has Caleb seen the dumb attacks by Oh God.
I made a video response to that. I made a video. I mean, Kyle Kulinski, he said, that I'm so against U.S. imperialism, I'm supporting Russian imperialism. So I just made a video rebuttal. You can go to my channel and watch it, explaining what imperialism actually means. Imperialism doesn't mean sending troops to a country. Imperialism means a global economic setup, capitalism in its monopoly stage. Yep. That's what imperialism is. And Russia is not that. Russia is not keeping countries poor in order to, enrich itself and dominate the world markets. It's actually doing the opposite. I've been to Crimea, right? I have actually seen with my own eyes Crimea. Right, the region that declared independence from Ukraine and joined with Russia in 2014, where there was a big Russian military base, and the people there all worked at the Russian military base, and so they just, when the USA overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014, they just voted to join with Russia. And I've been there, and I'll tell you, imperialism is about keeping countries poor, right? And what I saw was not a country that was being kept poor. I saw the opposite. Russia has poured economic development into Crimea. They've built this huge bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. They have brought in so many businesses and so much development. There's many different ethnic groups in Crimea, but they have all benefited from the development and from joining with Russia. And that's not imperialism. Imperialism is not a word for send troops to a country. Imperialism is not a word for expanding territory. And it's unfortunate. That's why we need to fight for the scientific Marxist definition of these terms. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. It is keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. And Russia is fighting imperialism by sending their forces into Ukraine to stand up against this NATO government that has been imposed on the country.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And that's the thing. If you talk about imperialism in the right way, then you have to address the capitalism problem. And some people don't want to address the capitalism problem because they're capitalists. Lex has a good question here. What, in your opinion, would happen if Ukraine joins NATO?
Well, I mean, at this point, Ukraine joining NATO would almost be symbolic. It would make sure that this conflict didn't end. That's for sure, because Russia does not want to have, the Ukrainian government, the one that was installed in 2014. It's very hostile to Russia, join and is right on its borders and is getting U.S. weapons and such. They don't want to have that country joining NATO right on their border. And that's kind of what, it's a big factor in what motivated what's going on here. You have to remember that the way NATO works is if one NATO country gets attacked, all of them get involved, right? It's an alliance, right? That's how it works, that NATO countries all host troops from various other NATO countries. And that, Ukraine joining NATO would be a direct threat to Russia. You have to remember, Russia was promised when the Soviet Union fell that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, that it would not move 1 inch closer to Russia. And that promise has been broken over and over and over again. And in this case, now we have Ukraine, which had a pretty neutral, friendly government that was kind of trying to balance the Russian-speaking folks with the Ukrainian-speaking folks. It was just, kind of a neutral government. The USA toppled that and installed this fanatically anti-Russian government that's tearing down the World War II memorials, that's fining people and giving them tickets for speaking the Russian language. It installed that government in there. And now, if that government were to then join the NATO pact, that would be a threat on Russia. That's what that would be. That would be a huge threat. That would be like Russia sending troops to Mexico and piling a bunch of Russian troops in Mexico. We wouldn't tolerate that, obviously. And that's what that would be. And so, yeah, Ukraine joining NATO would not resolve this in any way.
Do you think that NATO should go?
Yes. Yeah. NATO doesn't benefit the United States. NATO was formed because after the Second World War, after the Nazis were defeated, in many countries, you had what they called people's democracies, which was government was formed made up of the various anti-fascist parties. It was the Communist Party in coalition, usually with the Socialist Party or the Social Democratic Party. Usually there was some kind of Christian anti-fascist party as well. And the countries that were liberated by the Soviet Union in the fight against fascism, they established these people's democratic governments, they were called. And the people's democratic governments did not allow any former Nazis or Nazi collaborators in their governments. They said, if you worked with the Nazis to occupy this country, you're not allowed to be part of the government. That's where the government of East Germany came from. That's where the government of Czechoslovakia came from. That's where the government of Bulgaria came from. These were what they called the people's democratic governments. And the United States didn't like that because after the Second World War, the United States was busy recruiting all the Nazis to fight communists. And, in France and in Germany, West Germany and Spain and all these places, all these former Nazis were being recruited to run U.S. intelligence and run U.S. military forces. And the United States was kind of getting ready to fight against communism. So NATO was formed as an anti-communist bloc, basically, to prevent the spread of these anti-fascist people's democracies that were emerging in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that's why NATO was formed. And you have the Greek Civil War, where the United States, that had just ended a war with Nazis, is suddenly, working with Nazi collaborators in the Greek monarchy to fight against the People's Democratic anti-fascist coalitions in Greece. You can, go across the line there. In France, for example. In France, the communists were very popular after World War II because they had been la resistance, right? It was the communists who, when the Nazis took over France, they were the ones who blew up train tracks, and they were the ones that got jobs in, gun factories and sabotaged the guns. And the communists were the heroic underground anti-fascist fighters. So after the Second World War was over, they had an election in France, and the Communist Party did amazingly well, and they won a lot of seats in the government. And then because France, wanted to be part of NATO and wanted to get Marshall Plan aid, France was basically forced to kick all the communists out of the government, even though they were elected. They were kicked out of the cabinet. That happened, right after the Second World War. And, the way the United States was operating was you weren't allowed in the aftermath of the Second World War, you weren't allowed to have communists in your government, even if the people voted for you. And that's what was going on. And the most blatant example of that is on the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Union liberated the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, and the bottom half of the Korean Peninsula surrendered, and then you had U.S. troops there. And so the idea was that they would have one Korea, and they'd have elections for all of Korea, and they would elect a new government. But then the United States supported Syngman Rhee to become the military dictator of South Korea, and established a military dictatorship. And then the peoples on Jeju Island, who were sympathizers with communism, they started protesting for democracy. So then U.S. troops and the South Korean military went to Jeju Island and killed thousands and thousands of people. And so in response to that, you had a situation where Korea was divided. You had the Korean War, and Korea has been divided ever since. And that, in country after country, the communists wanted to be part of coalition governments. That's the most untold story. Mao and Chiang Kai-shek wanted to form a unified government in China. They wanted, after World War II, after Japan was kicked out of China, they wanted to have a unified government where the nationalist KMT party of Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party could rule together, could rule China together. But the United States said to Chiang Kai-shek, you can't have the Communist Party in your government. And then after that, the KMT party started trying to dismantle the Chinese Communist army that had fought against Japan and started trying to take their guns away. And Mao said, look, you've already told us we're not allowed to be part of the government, and now you're trying to take our guns away. Are you going to kill us all or whatever? So they had the Chinese Civil War. But the communists didn't want to take power in these countries violently. And that's what needs to be remembered. They wanted a peaceful transition. In China, they tried to peacefully join the government after World War II, and the USA wouldn't allow it. In South Korea, they wanted to have elections for all of the Korean Peninsula, and the USA wouldn't allow it. And in Eastern Europe, they formed these coalition governments of anti-fascist forces. They didn't want any Nazis to be part of the governments in Eastern Europe, but the United States wasn't willing to cooperate with them and was kind of absorbing all these ex-fascists and Nazis. So the idea that these communists were violent and they were just trying to spread communism through violence around the world, that doesn't match the reality of what happened. NATO was formed to prevent democracy. NATO was formed to prevent the democratic rights. People after World War II in many different countries wanted to vote for the communists because they were so admired in the fight against fascism. NATO was formed basically to prevent people from exercising that right. I know that's a lot of obscure history. I apologize for going on so long, but there you go.
No, very educational. So I have to ask, like, what do you think at this point could be the best outcome for this situation?
My hope is that that what will happen is that Ukraine and their leaders will say, all right, we want this to stop. We're going to leave Lugansk and Donetsk alone, and we're not going to join NATO, and we're not going to have weapons piled up on our border. And Russia will say, okay, that's fine. And they will pull their forces out, and Russia will pull their forces out, and the Ukrainian government will agree to Russia's terms and will be left intact. And that would be the ideal situation here. And that's what Russia wants. Again, Russia is not trying to occupy Ukraine. Russia is not, their goal here is not to like take over Ukraine and bring it into Russia. This is not really an invasion. Okay. If you want to get technical, there are different definitions of the word invasion. Okay. Invasion, like a home invasion. If someone comes into your house and you didn't tell them to be there, well, that's technically your home invaded. So if you want to use that definition, it might be. But invasion, generally, the definition includes an intent to take over or occupy or seize territory. Russia's not doing that. They have no intention of absorbing Ukraine into Russia or forcing Ukraine to become part of Russia. They don't even want to have their forces there. They want their forces to leave. But they have made very, very clear that the shelling of the people in the eastern regions must stop. And they've made very, very clear on top of that, that in addition to that, that they do not want this virulent anti-Russian government to continue to, stockpile U.S.-made weapons and talk of joining NATO and talk of getting nuclear weapons. And they are making the point. They are sending their forces in to take the Ukrainian military apart. And, a lot of these reports, they just get repeated as facts. I saw in that Young Turks clip that you were showing earlier, they were saying, oh, it's a fact that Russia is targeting civilians. No, that is not a fact. That is not a fact. A lot of videos have been debunked and shown to be not of Ukraine. But what is, being shown is that in a lot of these areas, Russia is actually, people are kind of blown away by the precision through which they are only hitting military targets. There are people that I talk to in Ukraine that are part of my organization, and they've talked about how they're kind of blown away by how, Russia, yes, there's somebody whose family is from Ukraine, and he's on the phone with his family every night talking to them. And they talked about how, Russia made a point of, they did strike the town that his relatives live in, but the only thing they hit was a tractor factory. And the reason they hit that tractor factory is because that tractor factory makes tanks for the Ukrainian military. And they did not hit a single other target in the town. And the precision with which Russia is striking and breaking apart the Ukrainian military is quite effective. And we're just hearing all kinds of inaccurate information. All these stories have been debunked. You showed the Snake Island thing. That's been debunked. And, there's so many of these stories out there. I mean, there was the famous Palestinian girl who held up her fist at an Israeli soldier. I've seen that circulating throughout the internet, and they're saying that's a Ukrainian girl saying it to a Russian. I mean, this is so ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So much fake news out there, and then at the same time, there's all this fake news out there being spread. At the same time they're spreading all this fake news, they are trying to actively prevent you from hearing the other side by shutting down RT and banning RT from social media outlets. Yep. I mean, and so, if they're trying to shut up one side and you've caught them lying to you over and over and over again, at that point, you can't believe them. And if you knew somebody who lied to you once, lied to you twice, lied to you again, lied to you again, lied to you again, and then on top of that, there was somebody else who disagreed with them and they were always trying to prevent that person from speaking, you might think that's not the most honest person. Now, wouldn't you? That's what we should be thinking about mainstream media right now.
Good points. Good points. Thank you, Brothwaite, for the super chat. Thanks, America. Manhandling of this huge mess. Ukrainian neo-Nazis are now pouring into Romania and Poland and other European states. Further destabilization will happen. Another U.S. screw up. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for this one, Working Man. Thank you, Sabs, for talking about Russia. And thank you for inviting Caleb Maupin. Thank you both for that. And thank you, Tusker. Is Putin attempting to force a recognition of a multipolar world? And is it also an attempt to break US dollar hegemony? Good question.
Well, I mean, I think a multipolar world is inevitable at this point. The United States and Western Europe are not going to be able to keep dominating the world as they have, right? I mean, what started in the 20th century with the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution is continuing. Eurasia, Russia and China have grown and gotten stronger. And other countries around the world are getting stronger. And the world is not going to stay centered around Europe forever. That's just a fact. I mean, one of the worst things about this is, and I've seen this, and many times US media voices have slipped and said things like, wow, this is happening in a European country. This is happening in a civilized country. Oh, this is happening in these refugees aren't like the ones from Syria and Libya. No, this is in a civilized. I mean, they're blatantly being racist here, right? This doesn't happen to white people. This doesn't happen to Europeans. They're saying this. I mean, there's clips of this where they're just blatantly being racist, but it's based on this assumption that Europe and the United States will stay at the top of the world, and the rest of the world is going to stay, poor and under their boot heels for the rest of time immemorial. And that's not going to happen. I mean, the world is changing. What started in the 20th century is continuing, and multipolarity is a reality. And I don't think this is an attempt to force multipolarity. I think it's an attempt to draw a line in the sand. And I also think as far as US dollar hegemony, right? I mean, the US dollar is, the top currency. It's widely used all over the planet. That's not always going to be the case. And the more sanctions the United States puts on countries, the more other currencies are going to advance. And that's just a reality of the situation. The value of your currency tends to increase the more countries that use it. The US dollar, and specifically the petrodollar, has been a big, reason that the United States has stayed on top. But that's rapidly changing, I would say.
One of the things I noticed too, I was watching the State of the Union address last night, and it was interesting to me, all of the people that were willing to stand up for Ukraine, and they said, we have to protect the Ukrainian people. We should let them come into the United States. A lot of support for them, but no mention of people in Somalia or Yemen, and Biden had just bombed Somalia again last week. Mainstream media is not really talking about it, and it's really disturbing to me, and it really does feel racist to me. It's like their focus is on, let's help the European people and let's just forget about, the brown people in Somalia and Yemen.
Well, sure. And there's reports about, there have been attacks on Chinese people living in Ukraine because China is perceived as being aligned with Russia. I mean, China hasn't fully, aligned with Russia here. They've said that they blame the United States overall for the crisis, but, they're trying to be pretty neutral. But that in Ukraine, we're seeing Ukrainians are targeting, Chinese people who live in Ukraine with hate crimes. We've also seen that I know at the border, there has been harassment of African folks that are leaving Ukraine and such. And so, there is examples of this happening. And I mean, look, this Ukrainian far right, this Azov battalion that mainstream media is now just trivializing, laughing off, saying it's not a big deal. They're vicious folks, and they're not very nice. And my good friend Alex Rubinstein, he pointed out that many people don't realize this, but in Lviv, in the Ukrainian city of Lviv, there is an entire restaurant themed around anti-Semitism and hating Jews, right? I mean, an entire restaurant that is set up to push anti-Semitism, where they have menus without prices on them, and they have like waiters who dress in like Orthodox Jewish costumes, and you have to haggle with them for your food. And it's one of the most disgusting racist things. And it's actually built on the ruins of a synagogue that was destroyed in the 16th century. And it's really offensive. I mean, these people tear down World War II memorials. I mean, they are having torchlit marches in support of Stepan Bandera. In 2014, when these forces overthrew the government in Kiev, one of the first things they did when they took the government building, like the equivalent of the Capitol building in Kiev, they actually unfurled, I kid you not, the Confederate flag from the United States. And just to make a statement, just to say, you know, just to make a statement to racists in the United States that we're with you, we're part of the same thing, they unfurled the American Confederate flag in the Ukrainian Capitol building. So, you know, the fact that they laugh this off and they say it's not a big deal, it is a big deal. And when these forces have been absorbed into the official Ukrainian government, this is a big deal. And it's particularly disturbing to see the left, right? TYT, the bread tube types, who have been calling everybody a Nazi for the past 5 or 6 years. You're a Nazi, I'm a Nazi, everyone's a Nazi. Oh, you don't want to vote for Biden, you're a Nazi. Oh, everyone's a Nazi. And now there's actual Nazis being armed by the United States, and that's fine. And they're okay with that. And if that doesn't reveal these people to be the biggest bunch of hypocrites in the world, I don't know what does.
Well said. Thanks for the super chat, Empire Forever. Good show tonight, Sabby. I had a mod on another lefty show threatened to block me for bringing up the Azov battalion on a live stream, calling it Russian propaganda. These are scary times. I agree. And thank you for this one, Chase. Caleb, is the U.S. putting Russia in a trap?
Well, I mean, that is a strategy the United States has long used. Zbigniew Brzezinski, he talked about the Afghan trap, where he put the Soviet Union into a situation where they felt they had to intervene in Afghanistan, and that hurt the Soviet Union. And I think that may have been the intent here, to just, you know, work on Russia for so long that they felt they had no choice but to intervene now in Ukraine. And now with the calls that we're hearing at this point, where they're calling for international volunteers and all of that, it seems like the intent of the United States is going to be to try to prolong this war. And that will hurt Russia in the long term, right? Right now, Russia's military is very, very effective. But if Russia ends up having to remain in the country for a very long time, that could take a very significant toll on the country. And my hope is that Russian troops can leave as soon as possible, that they can get the security guarantees they need, and that they can withdraw. The people in the eastern regions can get their independence and their safety. And I think it would be in the best interest of everyone if the Russian troops were able to leave as soon as possible. That is what Russia wants. Pretty clearly, Russia doesn't want to occupy Ukraine, and they know that is a trap. And what scares me, what terrifies me, is seeing that appears to be what the United States is aiming to do. And one thing I want to add, in addition to this call for international volunteers, there's a whole lot of Ukraine grifting going on the internet right now. A whole lot of people are saying, "Oh, send your money here to help Ukraine." I would urge people, look, I want to help the people of Ukraine as much as you do, right? We all see what's happening there. You know, it's very bad. A lot of people are suffering. But how much of this money is actually going to go to help the people of Ukraine, right? I mean, a lot of it might just go to buy a new yacht or a new boat or a new, mansion for some pro-NATO Ukrainian oligarchs. And some of it might even go to buy guns for that Nazi Azov battalion. We really don't know. And that, the fact that so much money, the fact that the Ukrainian government, the actual government of Ukraine, set up a Patreon, okay?
Nope.
That's a little bit, that makes me feel like not only is the United States, engaging in this geopolitical maneuver and all of that, but it also makes me feel like that there's some cynical money grabs going on. And I really hope people don't fall for that.
Agreed. Amazon has gotten in on this as well, which is pretty sad. Pretty sad. Well, Caleb, thanks so much for coming on and educating all of us. You're always welcome back.
Sure. I always love coming on. You have a great program here. You do great stuff. And my best wishes to you in your work. And, we need Medicare for all, schools for all, jobs for all. Thanks for having me on.
Bye.
Bye-bye.